Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our presentation regarding residential permit parking for the City of Lancaster. Obviously, this has been a long time in coming. We've had this moratorium for more than 2 years, and we've been trying to look at the ways that we have to understand the streets and the parking and residential permit parking in order to do this work. We've brought on the consultants Kimley Horn. Robert Farron will be the one who's giving the presentation, and we'll be able to talk about what we've learned, what the challenges are, what we think some of the key recommendations are, and still be able to have more input from you, not only in terms of understanding what you're seeing, but at the tail end having breakouts where you can explore particular items in a very particular way. We're very excited about this. It's a very more difficult challenge than we thought it was going to be in the first place, but what isn't? I mean, we're all trying to make it all work. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to open it to Robert Farron, and welcome again to this evening's RPP discussion. Robert.
Thanks, Director Campbell. And welcome everyone this evening. A couple housekeeping items. There is an echo up here. A couple housekeeping items before we start. Does anyone need Spanish interpretation for this evening's presentation?
Repeat that.
Does anyone need Spanish interpretation for this evening's presentation? And we have an interpreter here if that's needed. Okay. So welcome again this evening. My name is Robert Farron, and we have been contracted by the city to look at your residential parking permit program and ways that we can look at improving that program over time. What we're going to cover this evening is the purpose of this project, go over the schedule quickly, and talk about the engagement summary and the feedback we've already heard from the community that helped inform these draft recommendations you're going to hear about this evening. We'll wrap up with some next steps at the conclusion of the presentation. When you signed in, there were comment cards. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Okay, I'm hearing this ridiculous echo behind me, so I want to make sure everyone can hear me. When you signed in, there were comment cards. Those comment cards are for you to fill out throughout the presentation. You can wave your hand, and Emma can collect those. Those are good opportunities. We're going through this presentation, which is quite lengthy. If you want to make sure you don't forget any of those comments, we'll be trying to answer those throughout the presentation. And at the conclusion of the presentation, we'll try to answer as many of those before we go into breakout groups. You're going to see there are topics we're going to cover as part of the program, and those topics are broken out into 3 different areas of the room. So after the presentation, we'll try to answer as many Q&A through the comment cards, through your feedback, and then we'll break into those different groups for more detailed Q&A and discussion. So let's get started. So the purpose of our project, and really the purpose of the RPP, is to efficiently utilize predominantly residential on-street parking areas, particularly for neighborhood residents. We want to balance the neighborhood resident parking needs with that of business owners, contractors, and visitors. And one of our main goals is to comprehensively evaluate the RPP program to identify potential improvements. We started this project several months ago, and we're now in the phase where we have developed draft recommendations, and we're soliciting your feedback both tonight as well as over the next month through an online survey, culminating in those recommendations being finalized in the September timeframe. We'll get more into what that timeline looks like here toward the end of the presentation. A little overview of where we've been so far from a stakeholder engagement perspective. We held online and in-person surveying in the month of May. We had a traffic commission presentation and open house on May 14th. Several of you certainly may have attended that. We followed that up with a virtual open house on May 16th, and of course we've had local media coverage both in anticipation of this meeting as well as leading up to those meetings. We've had a lot of different ways for people to get engaged and to hear your feedback on how the system currently works and ways we can improve the RPP program. Some of that feedback we've heard so far, again, through Engage Lancaster, we saw over 700 survey responses. That is a tremendous number of survey responses. That's a testimony to folks' involvement in the process and also city staff getting out into the field, into the neighborhoods in the month of May. We don't typically ever see that kind of response. You can see a map here on the right showing hotspots of where those responses came from by where folks indicated their address. About 65% of those respondents were permit holders. We didn't just want to hear from permit holders, we wanted to hear from folks that don't have permits, folks that live, work, and play in the city of Lancaster. In terms of some of the feedback we heard from permit holders, the resident permit was the most common permit type at 98% of respondents. Business permits are also offered under the program, as well as contractor and visitor permits. And generally, respondents indicated they were satisfied with the program. You can see, so on the left-hand side, you can see how satisfied folks were with the application renewal process. The large majority were very satisfied or satisfied. And then their overall experience with the current RPP parking experience was a little more skewed towards satisfied as well as neutral. Some of the challenges we heard from responses, the majority of folks either have trouble finding a parking spot even with their permit, or trouble finding a spot to pick up and drop off on permit streets. And then there's kind of a couple other challenges, but in general, what we heard through multiple methods was if I have a permit, sometimes I still have trouble finding a parking space on my street. As was mentioned, non-permit holders also provided feedback. And actually, of those non-permit holders, 21% lived in an RPP zone. So I think there's some assumptions around if I'm on an RPP street, I certainly automatically have a permit. For whatever reason, these folks do not have a permit, and we asked the primary reason why they didn't. And 21% said that they didn't need a permit. The large majority said other. We captured some of that feedback, but generally they just didn't see value in needing that permit. We asked non-permit holders, do they feel like being near an RPP street, but living on a non-RPP street? So I live on a block near an RPP street, but I don't have it. Do they believe that's creating a parking challenge? Just over half of users noted no noticeable difference or were unsure. However, 45% did see some effect of the RPP zones on their street. We asked for some general challenges between RPP and non-RPP holders, 1 being not an issue and 5 being a major issue. In general, folks did not believe there were major issues in general. The ones that popped up were difficulty finding a parking space, as well as lack of enforcement. Those are the top 2 for RPP holders. And for non-RPP holders, difficulty finding a parking space. You can see on here we asked questions around double parking, insufficient loading zones, blocked pedestrian crosswalks, other issues. In general, those did not rate as high as difficulty finding a parking space or a perceived or real lack of parking enforcement. The snapshots on the right here from our virtual engagement. And so there were several areas where those attendees dug into, but some of the common feedback we heard through the course of the surveys, the in-person and virtual meetings, was a request for enhanced enforcement, an increase in the number of RPP spaces, an easier renewal and application process, expanding short-term parking options for those pickup and drop-off opportunities, revising the signage as well as the notices that go out, making sure that parking information is accessible to folks so people know the rules, And street cleaning came up multiple times. Now, that is not in the scope of our work. We are focused on RPP. Of course, if you have an RPP, you then are following street sweeping, street cleaning restrictions. So that did come up over the course of the survey. So we took our understanding of your system as it's currently designed. We took the feedback that I just went through, and we looked at broader industry best practices of how cities are grappling with RPP, and we came up with draft recommendations I'm going to walk through right now. A reminder for these recommendations. These are recommendations from a consultant. These are recommendations that we want your feedback on. You're going to hear about some policy recommendations, things that maybe a code needs to be changed or a rule and regulation needs to be changed, and then some programmatic recommendations. And what I mean by that is, how do you apply for a permit? What are the time limits on the street? This will require additional effort to implement. So whatever you're hearing tonight, these are draft. They will not be implemented tomorrow. We want your feedback to help form what those final program recommendations are going to be. But you're going to hear there's a lot of different topics we're going to cover, and that's going to take some time for the city and the parking authority to implement if these do become final. There's 5 categories we're going to cover, and I hope I don't get too many glazed over eyes this evening. We're going to talk about 5 major categories before we get into Q&A. One, we're going to start with the RPP designation process, and what we mean by that is the what, where, when, and how RPP districts are established, modified, or removed. So if you don't have an RPP district on your street, in your area, we're going to walk through what that proposed designation process looks like. And if you currently have a district, we have some recommendations on how those could be modified, added to, or removed over time. We're going to talk about permit eligibility and issuance. That is very much, if you have RPP on your street, who's eligible and how do you get those permits and how much do those cost? And so there are some recommendations made there. We'll talk briefly about some RPP exemptions. Not everything is cut and dry. There are residential uses and business, and there are nonprofits and institutional uses. It's what makes the city great, and so we have some recommendations around some of those exemptions. We'll talk about the application and renewal process, and then finally we'll wrap up with enforcement. We break down the designation process into 4 steps. We're going to talk about how a district becomes eligible to pass go to the next step to become RPP, what that approval process looks like if you pass go, what type of restrictions would be placed on the street if you meet all the criteria, and how those could be modified over time. You're going to hear about some benefits throughout this process. We know that the current system has been in place for many years. There's been a moratorium in place for a couple of years now. And so we know there needs to be improvement, and we know that there needs to be benefit with these changes, right? So for this in particular, we're going to talk about some data-informed decisions, making decisions off of the demand and the parking utilization and how occupied streets are and by whom. We're going to talk about equitable curb access. We want to prioritize certain users, certain groups, but not to the complete detriment of others. This is a very vibrant city. Parking challenges are often good challenges. We just have to kind of work through them. So we want to make sure there's still equity in who can access the curb and the parking lane. We believe that these draft recommendations can increase availability in parking and also create some permit flexibility for those that receive permits. And above all, can increase compliance. We want to make sure that folks that have a permit know the rules and how to use that permit appropriately. And we want folks that don't have a permit to also use the parking and the curb lane appropriately and avoid getting a parking ticket. So I would talk a little bit about the current process with determining what streets become eligible for RPP restrictions. The current process, and so just to orient you on the right here, is an analysis we did where we looked at how your permits are being utilized, how your permits are being issued by district. So the zones in orange indicate greater than one permit issued per space, so essentially issuing more permits than parking spaces in those areas. The yellow on a zone level is approximately a 1-to-1 ratio between permits issued and spaces. In the green is where there are more spaces than permits that have been issued. And so right now there are no general entrance requirements to become an RPP. So pre-moratorium, you came to Traffic Commission with a petition and went through a process, and then RPP was established. But there were no entrance requirements preceding the petition process. It's a block-by-block approach. You can see here in red, you can see here in red where the current RPP restrictions are. It's a bit of a patchwork. And because of that, so it's been a block-by-block approach. It's been a petition-led approach. There have been subjective rules and regulations. It's, again, not been informed by data. And really, there hasn't been an assessment of what are the current demands and needs of those streets. So this has led to a patchwork of regulations and, quite frankly, some inequitable parking prioritization where some areas are not even issuing enough permits to cover the parking spaces, and others, there are too many permits being issued for the number of available parking spaces. So it's created inequities across the entire system. This is another map showing at a block level, where in some cases, by address, we have more than 3 permits being issued for the available parking spaces on the street in red, between 2 and 3 in orange, 1 to 2 in yellow, and 1 or less in green. So you see that there, in general, most of the streets are in green. Most of the streets, permits have been issued, and there are more spaces available than permits issued. But in several instances, we have blocks where there's been an oversubscription of permits issued to those blocks. So again, this is leading to that inequity across the system. Are there ways that we can level that out? So we're going to go through a couple criteria here, and please, I know I'm going over a lot of information, use the comment cards, please jot down notes for yourself, and we're going to want to try to answer those clarifying questions and comments as we get to the end of the presentation. So currently you have a block-based approach, and that means that, again, there's a patchwork of restrictions and some immediate spillover effects. My block gets RPP, all of a sudden that parking demand moves to the next block. Several months later, there's probably someone raising their hand, especially that corner house, saying, now I want RPP, and we kind of perpetuate that. There's also zone-based approaches. Several cities will take a much larger area. That map I showed you earlier with the zones, not every block had RPP. Some cities will say, okay, all those streets have RPP. That can create some unequal parking prioritization, meaning residents now have priority in a very large area. That includes businesses, maybe places of worship, other civic institutions. And so that can create some unintended consequences. Maybe people don't go to those areas of the city anymore. Maybe it becomes a more challenging situation. We landed on a hybrid approach where the entrance requirements to expand, create new RPP zones, you would need to have a 2-by-2 block area. That reflects the local street grid, of which is highly granular. You have a lot of density. It's a very walkable city. So if you were to put this 2-by-2 block area, this is an example of Chestnut, Lime, Plum, and King. It also responds to some of the current restrictions. It is a patchwork, but if you layered on a 2-by-2 block area, you would start filling in some of those gaps potentially, where there are not RPP restrictions. In areas where it may just be one block and that's it, there may be some other solutions for that street. So we're recommending a hybrid approach where to begin the process, to pass go in the RPP journey, you would need to have a 2-by-2 block area defined to start the process. The other part of the process we want to look at to determine should those streets have RPP. We're not saying they don't have a parking issue, but should they have RPP as the right solution to help solve that parking issue? We're recommending to look at land use. We want RPP to be on predominantly residential streets. There are several instances in your current program where the residential land uses are actually the minority and not the majority. We want to look at external traffic generators. What do we mean by that? What's causing the issue? Is it a hospital? Is it restaurants? Are someone charging for parking on the end of the block, and so everyone's trying to find the free parking? So determining what those traffic generators are. We want to look at residential density. We don't want to be in a situation where we're issuing 3 and potentially 4 permits per parking space. That just creates a lot of frustration. I've gone through a whole process, and you're pretty much telling me I have a hunting license. So can we create a little more balance in the system? So we want to look at the density of the residential. And then we want to look at off-street parking. And in some cases, and we didn't look at that specifically here, but as we look at RPPs around the country, often there is ample off-street parking, garages or lots. They may charge for those, there may be restrictions, but that creates a situation where there's parking available, people aren't using it, they're parking on street, and they're impacting others. So we want to look at both the scale as well as these different built environment criteria to determine, do you enter the RPP intake process and get to an approval process? On the approval process, we are not recommending any changes to the petition process. We're recommending that there is still a 75% or greater petition process that remains in place. We are recommending that you need to get that on a 2x2 block scale and get away from the block by block approach that then pushes the parking pressure around the corner. That will generate additional permit flexibility for folks that are essentially on an island with permit restrictions, and there's not a ton of value to that because they can't go around the corner because those streets are unmanaged. And most importantly, we're recommending that we use data to drive the decision-making process, and that's the requirement for a parking study, to document overall parking utilization, to determine, is this the right solution? What does that parking study look like? This would be something that the city, once a petition process comes forward, the city would look at parking demand, and they look at parking utilization on the street in the morning to document resident demand, during the midday to document any kind of external traffic generators, and then in the evening to document both resident need as well as other evening traffic generators. Within that, we built in thresholds. A street needs to be at least 60% utilized to be deemed appropriate for RPP. We imagine there are some areas of RPP currently where there's been far less than 1 permit issued a parking space. We're not sure what the actual value is in that, other than maybe prioritizing just residents on that street when there's still availability. We want to make sure there's a parking challenge, right? So at least 60% observed peak parking occupancy, and we want to see at least half of that come from external traffic generators, meaning we want to see at least half of that come from non-residents. We see again and again in RPP systems across the country, residents against residents vying for parking spaces. You put in a permit program, everyone has to get a permit, and the result is still the same. So we want to avoid that, and we want to document if there are folks coming from outside the area and parking on those streets. That's where it makes sense to have RPP. Right now, you have a combination of restrictions. You have some daytime restrictions that are time limited, and you have some nighttime restrictions that are permit only. We're recommending that based on the data, you funnel down a path of either time-limited daytime, time-limited nighttime, or the introduction of paid parking in resident permit areas for non-permit holders. And I'm not going to go into this chart. We can talk more as we get into the breakouts, but based on based on the need. So for instance, if parking demand is really heavy during the day but not at night, this recommendation would say you have a time limit or paid permit restriction during the day. Conversely, if you have a nighttime issue, not a daytime, we don't want to restrict the entire street the entire day. So you would have an evening restriction, but not a daytime restriction. And we break the day up 8 to 6, 6 to 8, which is very similar to what is under the current system. But again, this is all based on data and not necessarily the whims of kind of options. I'd say overall, overall limited options, or just what's out there today. We want to expand the toolbox. The system hasn't changed. That's just not the moratorium. There's really no documentation. If I'm on an RPP street, do I want to change my restrictions? Do we want to remove them, modify them? So we're recommending a modification process. And if you want to modify your district, you would go through the same process I just talked about, but it provides that option for residents. Some of these restrictions were put in place decades ago. Things have changed. So there's an opportunity now to change those areas through this data-driven approach. We're also recommending a phase-out process for quote-unquote non-conforming RPP districts. We suspect there are certainly some RPP districts where they would not meet any of these criteria, and there could be a process over a number of years to remove those restrictions. About halfway there. Permit eligibility and issuance. So this is the who and how RPP permits are administered. So we just talked about, for those in the room that I should have asked this question, by a raise of hands, who currently lives on an RPP street? Okay, so then I'll do a raise of hands for the opposite. Who does not live on an RPP street? Okay, good mix. Okay, good. So that conversation was for both, but in particular non-RPP holders, or folks that do not live on an RPP street. That is the recommended process post-moratorium from our team to the city on how to restart the process under these new recommendations. As a current RPP holder on a current RPP street, that process could also be used to modify your restrictions if you've seen things change over time. Now I want to get into, you have RPP. Who gets a permit? How much do they cost? So we're going to talk about 3 key items. Who's eligible? What type of permits are we going to offer under a potential new system? And what's the pricing of those permits? Some of the benefits we're going to talk about is increasing permit parking availability. Again, we have areas where we have a lot of permits issued for not a lot of parking spaces. So how do we better manage that to provide value to the permit? We want to get away from that hunting license situation. We want to improve customer service, whether it's a permit holder or non-permit holder. And we want to create some administrative consistency. We want to make sure that everyone's good stewards of public dollars and making sure that we're creating an efficient system for everyone. So item 1, in terms of address eligibility, any resident or business in an RPP restricted street would be eligible very much as they are today. What we identified through our process, which is fairly unique to Lancaster, is about 20% of account holders live on non-RPP streets. So they look out their door and there are no RPP restrictions, but they have a permit to park in a nearby zone. That is unique. And so we're recommending there's a phase-out process over time of those, unless those streets would be deemed eligible for RPP under this new criteria. In terms of the types of permits offered under the program, what would not change are the resident permit requirements or the business permit requirements. What would change, and this is based off of utilization as well as feedback, is sunsetting the contractor permit. We actually heard most people weren't even aware this was actually a permit, and we're creating a new permit type to help still make sure contractors have access. We would be looking at introducing a temporary permit for those that need to come in compliance with rules that could be enforced for up to 90 days. So people who are moving may not have everything, all the addresses lined up to that place of residence. They'd have up to 90 days to meet that requirement. And one of the biggest changes here is moving away from a daily visitor permit or so many day visitor permit to an annual flexible permit. This will be license plate based. And if you had someone coming over, you could enter that plate into the system and they could park there and not have to pay or have a time limit. To make sure that people just don't use that and sell that to somebody or use that as maybe a permit that they couldn't get under the current system, there'd be a rule in place that plate couldn't be used more than 15 times in a month. That's really in the weeds, but as someone who probably has an RPP and a current visitor permit, we want to still provide flexibility and not have you have to figure out, is it for a day or 2 days or 3 days? You would just have an annual virtual permit that you could put on any plate as long as it didn't go past 15 consecutive days to make sure there isn't fraudulent use of those permits. And I suspect things like that we're going to get questions on afterwards, and certainly, certainly happy to clarify. In terms of fees, we want to do two things. We want to establish a low-income permit price, maintain the $20 annual fee for the first and second permit. There will be an income verification system for applicants. And in tandem with that, establish a progressive pricing structure. So what we heard generally was the limits generally work for people. There are folks that appeal and they want a third permit and greater. We're keeping it still at the 2 permits per household, per address, but we are recommending and suggesting it moves to a progressive rate structure where the first permit would be $30, the second would be $60, and under an appeal process, a third permit would be $120. And this is to reflect the value that permit offers and parking on a public street. And we were seeing more cities move to this to better manage the number of permits being issued and have people really think a little more critically. Do I need a permit? If so, how many permits do I need? Do I have off-street parking? Do I have other options to park my vehicle? Some cities that are doing that, right down the street in Philadelphia, they have a progressive pricing structure. In Hoboken, which is a similar population and certainly more dense, no question, but very similar challenges are around a lot of, certainly a lot of homes without off-street parking. There's a progressive rate structure. And in my hometown, Columbus, just also instituted a progressive pricing structure. And this is not to generate revenue. This is to just get people to think there's a value to these permits, and can we apply a rate structure that encourages folks to use what they need and not necessarily overburden the system when there may be some available off-street parking, either in garages or lots on property or nearby. These last 3 I'll move through really quickly. Does anyone represent an institutional use, place of worship? I guess, is there anyone other than a resident here? Maybe a business owner or anyone else? Okay, business owner, okay. The business permit structure does not change. We want to provide some exemptions for institutional uses as well as define an appeal process. And again, we want to make sure that there's equity in the system, right? There are not many streets in Lancaster that are singularly residential or singularly business. What makes this community great is you can walk around and go to different things. So we want to make sure the program reflects that. As an institutional use, there will be an application form for those that lack off-street parking. They're located on RPP streets. They would need to document their parking need, and they would have available up to 5 permits per institution. And then we're recommending defining an appeal process. And that appeal process, if you do not like any of these processes, generally there would be a documented appeal process you would go through the Traffic Commission. On to something more about, if I'm a permit holder, how does that experience look and feel? So there are 2 key recommendations we want to make. One, we want to increase information online for new and recurring applicants. That may sound a little trite, but right now the information is sporadic, whether it's on the parking authority site or the city site. It's good information, it's just not all in one place. So recommending that, as well as a tiered renewal process. I'll get into that in a second. We want to improve customer service, make sure there's a culture of compliance. What I mean by that is you use your permit properly, and if you don't have a permit, you don't get a parking ticket. So we want to consolidate information on the city website, the LPA website, develop customer FAQs. There were some questions about how do I even use my permit in the survey responses. We want to make sure that people understand how to use their permit. Develop an online eligibility and restriction map, so you can easily go online if you just moved here, and you can see what streets have RPP and who is eligible, and really drive as many customers online as possible. I mean, certainly parking authority staff can help, but we want to try to reduce those trips as much as possible and let people use their phone or their website to get this information. Right now, when you renew your permit, you generally have to apply as a new, with all the new information. So utility bill and all that information each year. It's kind of Groundhog Day every year. So we're recommending to move to a tiered system where actually you only have to do that every 3 years. By moving to a license plate-based system, I'll get to in a second, we can reduce on fraud. If you're a renewal and nothing's changed, check a box, off you go. It'll take you, 5-10 seconds. If there's a change in information, including, of course, a vehicle, you have to do a full renewal, but we're hoping this can streamline the process for existing permit holders. And lastly, enforcement. At the end of the day, none of this actually works if there's not any enforcement, right? The signs aren't clear and there isn't active enforcement. This was all for naught. So there are 3 key recommendations we want to make. One is to implement license plate recognition technology, LPR. Quote unquote, right size enforcement staff resources, make sure we're enforcing during the right times of day, and redesigning the RPP restriction signage. Certainly these benefits, we want to have effective enforcement that improves customer service. Again, create the culture of compliance. We don't want someone to come to a street and say, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can park here. We don't want that patchwork. We want things to be consistent. Of course, we want to be efficient with the use of public resources. So implementing LPR, this is a widely used parking enforcement technology. This is no different than going to the Pennsylvania Turnpike and having the LPR cameras. There are LPR cameras everywhere these days. We're recommending that these cameras are put on enforcement vehicles. That allows for digital enforcement. Enforcement officer drives down the street, snaps a picture of the license plate, it immediately knows, do they have a permit? Do they not have a permit? And it can also collect parking occupancy data. So those studies we were talking about earlier, we can use that technology to collect that information efficiently and effectively. By using LPR, enforcement will be more efficient and more effective, can also know if people have been there too long. Vehicle goes down the street, marks the license plate, comes back just over 2 hours later, is that vehicle in the same spot? Right now, it's a very tedious process, a highly manual process, and we're seeing city over city move to this technology so they can respond to customer feedback that perceived or real lack of enforcement. Following implementation of LPR, we're recommending the LPA potentially look at increasing staff. Right now, there's a little mismatch between daytime and nighttime based on the hours that are restricted versus the staff on call. We think a lot of that solves itself with LPR, but once LPR is implemented, looking to see, do we need to add some more staff or move staff between a daytime or evening, again, to make sure that the sign is enforced and the permit has value to permit holders and people expect, if I don't follow the rules, I'm gonna get a parking ticket. And lastly, we want to clean up the signage. Your signage has a lot of information on it. It is very text heavy. It is assuming that everyone can read that text. And so we are looking at something similar to that, but not entirely like that, that is MUTCD compliant. I broke a cardinal rule of putting an abbreviation without explaining it. The Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices from the Federal Highway Administration. Yes, there's a whole book on signs, 1,000 pages long. It's a great read. But the reality is there are standards around signs. And so when you go to a city, you start to understand, okay, if I see a green sign, I can park there. If it tells me it's for 2 hours, that's it. If it's a red sign, I shouldn't park there at all. So creating some consistency in the signage, reducing the text, standardizing that signage will go a long way in making sure that people are compliant and that we don't issue tickets for folks that just don't understand the rules. We're about to break out into Q&A, and if people have filled out comment cards, I hope you've found Emma, and we'd love to I'm sure there's some common questions and clarifying comments we can make so that our breakout sessions can be effective use of everyone's time this evening. But some of the next steps that you're going to see and expect. Shortly after this meeting, this presentation, apparently I'm being recorded. Hopefully I didn't say too many ums this evening. That will be on the Engage Lancaster website. We've used that platform throughout the process. And so the presentation will be on there as well as a short survey. Now you're providing the feedback tonight. That doesn't stop you from going to Engage as well. Provide that feedback over the month of August. We're going to take that feedback and modify these recommendations. These are draft. These are not final by any stretch. We'll use that feedback to modify the recommendations and present a final set of recommendations at the Traffic Commission meeting on September 10th. Following that decision, or the outcome of that Traffic Commission meeting, there's the potential to develop a phased project implementation. What that means is the potential to pilot these processes in a new area of the city or an existing RPP area. The city, I know there are willing participants probably here and that have been engaged in this process, that be willing to go through this process to make sure that it works as intended. And so there's opportunities to pilot these recommendations into the fall and into next year. But do know these are draft. We want to hear your feedback, modify those, and take those to the Traffic Commission for consideration in September. Our Q&A feedback sessions are broken into 3 groups. We have over here, which I'm going to be staffing, the RPP designation process. And we have some handouts at the table that have the slides, not all the slides, but the main slides to remind you, because we went over a lot of information this evening, of the what, where, when, and how RPP districts are established, modified, or removed. So I would suggest if I'm here tonight and I want RPP and I've been under moratorium, that's probably your first stop. We want to hear your feedback, get your questions, get your comments. The second group will be back here, permit eligibility and issuance. And those are for people that either have RPP or want to have RPP in the future, the who and how RPP permits are administered and how much they cost. We're going to be having city staff back there. We want to hear your comments and questions. And then the third one is whether you have questions about the exemptions, so the appeal process to the institutional use. I doubt there will be a lot of that this evening based on who's in the room. If you have questions around the application and renewal process, both the current process as well as these draft recommendations, and enforcement, that'll be right here. And I believe Lancaster Parking Authority team will help us staff that one. As they are the practitioners, right? The city has the code, the LPA administers much of this program, and so that's more the administration section. Questions, comments, concerns, please make your way over there after we break out. Before we break out into groups, do we have any clarifying, consistent?
So you might need to read some of them. I didn't understand all of them, so we might need some clarification.
Yes. Okay. And so I'm going to read these out loud, and I will try to answer questions. If I don't answer the question, it doesn't mean we haven't figured it out. It means we're still in the comment period, right? So these are good comments and questions we want to incorporate into the final recommendations. And so would the LPR system be restricted to solely use for parking enforcement and not used for law enforcement? We're speaking specifically about parking enforcement. I'm assuming the police already use LPR for other things. Most agencies do, but we're specifically talking about LPR for parking enforcement. Those would be mobile LPR units attached to a parking enforcement vehicle and used for making sure people, have they paid, do they have a permit, how long have they been parked there? Can you please explain 5 max permits per institution? So right now the business permit is a max of 5, and so we felt like that was a good number to start with, quite frankly. The caveat there is that institution needs to lack off-street parking. So this is a institution that's on RPP streets, surrounded by RPP. They have no off-street parking, and they need to have some kind of relief. So it'll be a max of 5. In particular, I'd say places of worship. Now, I'm oversimplifying. These are still going to be weekday restrictions. A lot of those things happen evening, weekend. Those are things that through appeal process, if they need to go beyond the max, they would go through an appeal process. But that's why we went to the 5. That's a current program in place for businesses. What's the budget for implementation of these proposals? The budget. That is something we have not figured out yet. So we're not to that point yet because we could go through this whole process and these recommendations fundamentally change. So we didn't want to get too far ahead of our skis on that one. Okay. 75% signature process. Huge block long apartment building creates issues. These are more comments than anything, actually. So I'm okay. I'm gonna move past that one. Are permits limits by individual address or by structure? We live in a townhouse duplex. Half is one townhouse, or joint neighbor is subdivided in apartments. I keep not using the right terminology, and I'm going to actually lean on a city rep to talk about the units and the number of, because I keep getting the term wrong in terms of parcels versus addresses. That current rule is not being recommended to be changed. So the current process would carry on. But I know I keep getting it wrong on apartments per unit.
So if there are 2 apartments in the same address.
But if it's a multi-unit, then it has a maximum of 5.
It's a multi-unit as a maximum of 5, yes. None of those, we're not recommending any changes to the limits. The limits are eligibility for residential permits. Okay, there's one specific about 400 West James. I want to talk to you afterwards because I'm trying to get the ones that are kind of more overarching. There are work vehicle exemptions. There are some exemptions in the code that we are not recommending any changes to. So there are for like emergency services. There are some kind of blanket statements in the current city code that you don't need a permit for those things. So those we're not recommending any changes to those. Are there other? Okay.
Okay, so this one, it was just the 2 stars. So what, explain the 2x2 block?
Yeah, the 2x2, I was reading this, the LPR, I think we answered the LPR one. So the permits would be license plate based. So the parking authority would know if they have a permit or not. That means the permit has to have the right plate attached to it. So that's something that the permit holder needs to make sure is current. But wouldn't be any stickers or hang tags anymore. The plate would be the credential. The 2x2 block area, what is this? So I'm actually going to go, well, I'll stick on this one. So again, the current process is block by block. And so it's a bit like whack-a-mole, right? I hit that restriction, I hit that parking demand, it moves to the next block. And so the 2x2 block is our best effort to say, you need to have a minimum area to start to pursue RPP. We are not saying that the parking demand on a street is not a challenge. What we're saying is we want to look at a broader area, because if we just do one block, we'll continue to add blocks, and then we're creating these islands of restrictions in this patchwork where one block is unrestricted, one block's restricted, and we start creating a lot of winners and losers in a very short area. By creating some consistency in a 2x2 block area, there's an expectation to everyone. Do I have a permit? Okay, I have certain restrictions here, and if I don't, I can only park for so many hours. And creating some consistency will also allow the permit to have more value. We heard repeatedly, especially from folks in the corners of districts, just outside districts, well, why do they, I can literally see the signs out my window, but I don't have access to it. And so we want to create a more comprehensive, holistic process to provide that flexibility that if I don't have RPP, if I have RPP and there's nothing on my block, I can park around the corner, or I can park on the block over. We don't want to create a situation we have now where the block behind me, that RPP has no value to it, and the block behind me, I can't park on the other block. So we want to create a little more consistency around that and get away from the block by block.
Better way to report habitual users. Why did we get the sticker system?
Better methods to report habitual, known, non-permit parkers. So I will say, and this is a conversation we've had often with residents, the permit sticker does give someone the ability to kind of go down the street and say, okay, you have a permit, you don't have a permit. That is a really ineffective way to enforce. The officer has to get out. They're having to look at the vehicle. If it's snowing, they can't see the windshield. LPR has been documented again and again by just driving down the street, and that vehicle is going to tell the officer right then and there, do they have parking rights or do they not have parking rights? Do they have a permit? Do they not have a permit? And so by moving to a license plate based system, you reduce fraud, duplication of permits, and the team that currently exists with the parking authority can be much more effective at their job. And quite frankly, it's also a safer situation for them because right now they're having to check every vehicle. If there's 10 vehicles on the street and 8 of them are in compliance, they have to check 10 vehicles. If they're driving down the street and 8 are in compliance and 2 are not in compliance, now they only have to check 2 vehicles, not 10. So they can be more effective and efficient at their job. It also collects data. So then there's a consistent stream of how many non-permit holders and permit holders, and that can kind of feed into the system and make it a smarter system. So it is a much more efficient, effective way, and we're seeing more cities move to this. The only requirement of the permit holder is that that plate is up to date in the system. Otherwise, they can move on. So you get a windshield replaced, you have to go get a new permit. You don't have to do that with the plate. If you get a new plate, then you have to update that in the system. That will reduce fraud and the habitual kind of use of these spaces beyond the time limit or folks that don't have a permit.
So this is something about East End Avenue, but I can't read. I'm having trouble reading this one. I might need a little bit of.
The East End Avenue person come talk to me after. That's a very localized specific item, so I want to have that conversation. The presentation cited some other best practices. Who is their consultant on those? So we looked at a number of industry best practices. Those were 3. We added in some more. There are countless examples. We were just trying to assemble similar size, not necessarily location, areas that have kind of historic downtown areas, lack of off-street parking, as well as some progressive cities as well. So I don't know if they had consultants for those. And why compare those to Lancaster? I said I wouldn't say Lancaster. I've lived next to 2 Lancasters in my life, and they were that. So Lancaster. My apologies. So we looked at population density. We looked at a number of factors. The reality is, to glean what is happening around the industry, we want to look at those cities. Do they have the same parking challenges as you on a day-to-day basis? No. Parking challenges are highly unique, but we do want to understand how are cities functioning with their RPP. Almost every city in the country started with the same RPP ordinance from Alexandria, Virginia in the 1950s. There was a Supreme Court case, a little knowledge here. You can wow someone later on at trivia. Every city copied that one because the Supreme Court said, yes, you can put in RPP. It went to the Supreme Court in the 1950s. So every city copied it. They've generally had those rules for the last 60 years. And so now cities are starting to say, gosh, our cities look a lot different these days. 9 to 5 commercial corridors now have evening bars and restaurants. Our cities are different now, and therefore our restrictions need to change. So cities are methodically, like Lancaster, are going through this process, and so we want to look at those and understand how are they doing it. Are they doing it well? What can we learn from them? And then implement what makes the most sense for Lancaster, knowing these are still very unique parking challenges you're facing. Hope that answered that question. So there's still some questions around apartments and multifamily, and again, right now there are no recommendations to change that. If there are folks in the room that want to change, like I want to hear that at the permit eligibility and issuance. So if you're not happy with kind of how that is currently working, we're not making any recommendations to change that, but we want to hear your feedback on that. And that's in general. I would say we covered, this program is pretty comprehensive. We're recommending changes to maybe a quarter of it. So that means there's 75% of it we're not recommending any changes to. That being said, if you have comments, concerns, questions, we want to hear those this evening as we break out. Delivery trucks, Amazon, FedEx not pulling the curbside. So our hope and expectation is, as we better manage the system, get a better handle on the number of permits issued, understand the parking demands, we can create some availability on streets, not all the time by any stretch. There will still be streets that will be full, and you still won't be able to find a space after this program is done because you have a lot of parking demand and not a lot of parking spaces. It's what makes the city great. It makes it very walkable. But the hope then is there's room for Amazon and others to pull over. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. That's not a unique challenge. Every city we're working in, there's a picture of an Amazon truck or FedEx blocking a traffic lane or crosswalk. So those are things that we need to continue to work with those operators on. That's not in the scope of this program, but our hope is there's a little more availability on these streets that they can pull over if they so choose. The drivers don't always do that.
There's one more that I'm going to take. This one is about the bus routes changing, and just the city is not actually in charge of the bus routes. That's the Red Rose Transit Authority, South Central Transit Agency. So they are the ones in charge of changing the bus routes. And then about a parking lot on Mifflin Street. For this meeting, we're just specifically talking about parking on street within the public right-of-way. So we can't really address these questions tonight, but maybe there's another venue.
So there were some very localized questions that if you do not hear the response, please come see me if you're going over to this section or others. If you have clarifying questions or concerns. At this point, just time check, it's 6:30. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think we're scheduled till 7. I'm sure we can say a little bit over. So we love to break out into the 3 different groups. There's not another presentation at this point. So if you just want to go to one and say, okay, I've got my questions answered, goodbye, that's great. You can hit all 3 in any order. We're going to be here to answer your questions, any kind of clarifying comments. And we want to hear your feedback. So we'll be writing our notes here. We'll be collecting this information as well. This is all going to go into how we revise these recommendations, as well as the information we get from the online survey. That'll be posted here in the month of August on Engage Lancaster. So with that, thank you for your attention in getting through a slog of information, and we'll be here to answer your questions for the next 30 plus minutes. So thank you.